There is a man who has done everything the teaching told him to do. He assumes the feeling of the wish fulfilled. He does it nightly in the state Goddard called akin to sleep, where the conscious mind goes quiet enough for the subconscious to accept an impression without arguing with it. He has read the books. He has done the visualization with the kind of discipline most people reserve for things they get paid to do. And the thing he wants, the relationship, the income, the recognition, does not arrive. What arrives instead is a variation of the same disappointment he has been living inside for years, dressed in new circumstances so that for a moment he doesn't recognize it. He blames the technique, he refines the technique, he does it again, more precisely this time, and the result is, again, not what he assumed. This isn't a failure of effort, it isn't a failure of belief. Something else in him is assuming something different, with more force than his conscious wish, and that something is winning every time. This video is about what that something is, how it got more authority over your circumstances than your conscious mind has, and the exact mechanism by which it overrides you. Start with what Goddard actually said, because almost everyone who quotes him hasn't understood how precise the claim is. In Feeling is the Secret, published in 1944, Goddard's argument isn't that positive thinking produces positive results. His argument is structural. The subconscious mind accepts whatever is impressed upon it as fact, and what's impressed upon it isn't the words you say or the thoughts you think. It's the feeling you inhabit. Feeling, in his vocabulary, isn't emotion in the loose sense. It's the assumed state, what you have, in your body and your self-concept, already decided is true about your situation before any evidence shows up. He called this assumption, and he was specific that assumption operates whether you're aware of making it or not. You're always assuming something. The only question is whether you're doing it on purpose. This is layer 1, and it's the layer almost every manifestation teacher stops at, because it produces a usable technique. Pick the feeling of the wish fulfilled. Inhabit it deliberately, especially in the state akin to sleep, where critical resistance is lowest and the subconscious takes the impression most readily. Do this consistently, and the assumption restructures the world around it. This isn't metaphor for Goddard. In his 1954 lecture series, The Law and the Promise, he describes assumption as a literal operating mechanism. Not a hopeful attitude, but a causal structure that organizes circumstance the way gravity organizes falling objects. Assume the end, the means will follow. This is true. It's also incomplete, and the incompleteness is exactly where the man in the opening lives. Because here's the question nobody asks when they learn the technique. Which assumption wins when there's more than one running at the same time? You assume the feeling of having the relationship. But you've also, for years, maybe decades, been assuming something else about your worthiness to be chosen, your safety and intimacy, your right to take up space in another person's attention. That second assumption didn't go anywhere when you started doing the technique correctly. It's still running. It's been running since before you had language for it, embedded not in your conscious intention, but in material you've spent your whole life not looking at directly. And the surface-level teaching never accounts for this part. The assumption with the most emotional charge wins, not the assumption you're most recently and most deliberately holding. Charge is the variable, not sincerity, not effort, not how many times you repeated the affirmation. Charge. That's the second mechanism, the one operating underneath the first, and it has a name in the tradition that named it before Goddard ever stood on a stage. Carl Jung, in Ion, published in 1951, describes the shadow as the sum of everything in the personality that the conscious ego has refused to acknowledge, not because it's necessarily evil, but because it's incompatible with the self-image the person has built and depends on for stability. The shadow doesn't disappear when it's refused. It goes underground, and from underground it organizes behavior, perception, and, this is the part that connects directly to Goddard's mechanism, assumption, with a force the conscious mind can't match. Because the conscious mind doesn't even know the assumption is there to compete with. You can't consciously out-assume something you haven't consciously acknowledged exists. You can only be run by it. Think about what this means for the man in the opening. He's consciously assuming abundance. He's unconsciously assuming, with decades of unexamined charge behind it, that he doesn't deserve what he's asking for. Maybe because somewhere in his early architecture, wanting too visibly was punished, or having too much made him a target. or being chosen came with conditions he's still organizing his life around avoiding. He's never looked at this directly, so it's never been revised. And an unrevised assumption in Goddard's own framework doesn't become inert just because a newer, prettier assumption has been placed on top of it. It stays active. It stays causal. And because it carries the charge of decades of unexamined fear, it outweighs the assumption he practiced for 20 minutes before bed. This is the priority signal. Reality doesn't respond to the assumption you're most proud of holding. It responds to the assumption carrying the most unresolved emotional charge, because charge, not clarity, not intention, not moral correctness, is the actual currency the subconscious deals in. The polished conscious wish is competing against a decades-old, unexamined high-charge signal, and in almost every case, the high-charge signal wins. Not because it's stronger in some mystical sense, but because it's had no competition. Nobody has gone in and revised it. It's been running on default since it was installed, undisturbed, while the conscious mind busies itself crafting a better-sounding assumption on the surface. This is also where the science gets interesting, because it isn't only a Jungian or Godardian claim. It converges with a finding in cognitive psychology that explains exactly why suppression, the refusal to look at shadow material directly, doesn't neutralize the material's power, but multiplies it. Daniel Wagner at Harvard ran an experiment in 1987 that's become one of the most replicated findings in the psychology of thought control. He instructed participants not to think about a white bear for 5 minutes, and to ring a bell every time the thought intruded anyway. The bear intruded constantly. More tellingly, when participants were later told they could think about the bear freely, they thought about it far more than a control group who'd never been told to suppress it in the first place. Wagner called this the ironic process. Deliberately avoiding a thought increases its frequency and emotional salience rather than decreasing it. His proposed mechanism is that suppression requires a monitoring process that continuously checks for the forbidden content, and that monitoring process, ironically, keeps the content active and charged precisely by trying to keep it away. Map this directly onto the shadow. The material you refuse to look at doesn't go quiet. It's material your own mind is forced to continuously monitor in order to keep refusing it, which means it stays charged, stays active, and stays positioned to dominate the assumption field indefinitely, for as long as it remains unexamined. This isn't folklore. It's documented behavior of suppression under laboratory conditions, and it explains with mechanistic precision why shadow material, the parts of the self the practitioner has spent the most energy avoiding, ends up with more causal authority over circumstance than the parts of the self the practitioner is most willing to display. The avoidance isn't protection. The avoidance is the charge delivery system. Now think about the woman who keeps leaving relationships that disappoint her in identical ways, dressed in different faces. She isn't unlucky, and she isn't choosing badly by accident. Her conscious assumption every time is that this one will be different. Her unconscious assumption, the one she's never been willing to look at directly, because looking at it would mean acknowledging something about her own self-concept, she's organized her entire adult identity around, not acknowledging, is running underneath, undisturbed, with all the charge that decades of avoidance has given it. The relationship isn't the variable. The unrevised high-charge shadow assumption is the variable, and it's selecting partners and dynamics that confirm it with the same mechanical reliability a thermostat uses to select a temperature. This is the mirror principle, and now you can see it with precision instead of metaphor. The world is yourself, pushed out, and the self that gets pushed out hardest, the self with the most causal force, isn't the self you present. It's the self you've spent the most energy refusing to look at. This is also why surface-level manifestation work so often produces what practitioners describe, almost universally, as the same problem in a new costume, a new city, a new partner, a new job with the identical dynamic. The pattern isn't coincidence, and it isn't karma in the popular sense. It's a perceptual filter, what neuroscience calls the reticular activating system, doing exactly what it's built to do. The RAS doesn't select evidence randomly. It selects evidence that confirms the dominant identity assumption, filters contradicting evidence below conscious threshold, and presents the selected evidence to the conscious mind as simply what's out there. If the dominant identity assumption is the high-charge shadow material rather than the polished conscious wish, the filter is built around the shadow's terms, not the wish's terms. The filter isn't passive, it's causal, and it's taking its instructions from whichever assumption is loudest, not whichever is newest. Here's the calibration, because these claims sit at different levels of certainty, and I owe you the distinction. Wegener's ironic process theory is well-replicated experimental psychology, robust, specific, peer-reviewed, and directly applicable to the mechanics of suppression. The reticular activating system's role in selective attention is established neuroscience, though applying it to long-range manifestation outcomes is an extrapolation, not a laboratory finding. The RAS explains what you notice, and noticing shapes what you act on and what opportunities you perceive, which is a more conservative and more defensible claim than saying it directly rearranges external events. Jung's shadow concept is clinical theory, built from decades of case observation, not a laboratory-verified mechanism the way Wegener's bear study is. It's a framework with extraordinary explanatory coherence, used by clinicians for a century, but it belongs to depth psychology, not experimental science. Goddard's assumption model is a metaphysical claim about the structure of reality itself, and there's no empirical research verifying that a subconscious assumption directly restructures external physical events. What can be said with confidence is that these four frameworks, one metaphysical, one clinical, one experimental, one neuroscientific, independently converge on the same structural claim. Unexamined, high-charge material outcompetes deliberate, low-charge intention for the position of operative identity. That convergence across four traditions that weren't built to agree with each other is the part of this video worth weighting most heavily. Not because convergence is proof, because convergence at this level, across domains with no reason to copy each other, is rare, and rare as data. So, what does revision actually require, mechanistically, if charge is the variable and not effort? Goddard's own answer, underused by most practitioners because it's harder than visualization, is the practice he called revision, not affirming a new future, but going back into a specific past scene that carries unresolved charge and replaying it differently in imaginative detail until the felt sense of the original event changes. This maps with unusual precision onto what contemporary neuroscience calls memory reconsolidation, the finding that a memory, once recalled, becomes briefly plastic and chemically unstable before it restabilizes, and that new emotional content introduced during this window can alter the charge of the original memory at a structural level, not merely cover it with a more comfortable interpretation. Karim Nader's reconsolidation research, building on earlier work by Joseph Ledoux at New York University, showed that this window isn't symbolic, it's a measurable neurochemical process. Goddard described revision as a technique decades before reconsolidation was characterized in a laboratory, and what he was describing returned to the charge scene and deliberately alter its felt content while the memory is active. Is structurally the same operation reconsolidation and research has since mapped at the level of synaptic protein synthesis. Whether Goddard understood the biology is beside the point. The structure he described and the structure the neuroscience proved are the same structure. Notice what this means for the practice itself in concrete terms. Revision, done correctly, isn't a vague instruction to release the past. It requires identifying the specific scene where the charge originated, not the general feeling of unworthiness, but the actual moment, the actual room, the actual sentence that was said or withheld, and re-entering it in imaginative detail with enough sensory specificity that the nervous system treats it as a live event rather than an abstract idea. This is precisely the condition reconsolidation research identifies as necessary for the memory's plastic window to open. The original memory has to be reactivated with enough fidelity that it destabilizes, and it's only in that destabilized state that new emotional content can actually overwrite the stored charge, rather than just sitting beside it as a competing, unintegrated assumption. This is why vague revision, telling yourself in general terms that you're worthy without returning to the specific scene carrying the original charge, so often fails to move the needle. It isn't entering the plastic window at all. It's adding a third assumption to a system that already has two in conflict, which makes the priority contest more crowded. not less. This is also why simply trying to suppress the shadow material harder, or drown it out with a louder conscious affirmation, doesn't work. And now you can see exactly why, mechanistically, instead of just being told, it doesn't work. Suppression, per Wegener, increases the charge through ironic monitoring. Affirmation without revision doesn't touch the original charge material at all. It adds a second assumption on top of the first, without resolving the first, which means both assumptions are now running simultaneously, and the older one, by virtue of decades of accumulated, unaddressed charge, still wins the priority contest almost every time. This is the precise reason the man in the opening can do everything the technique instructs and still get the old result. He's been assuming on top of the shadow instead of into it. He's been adding a second voice to a room instead of addressing the one that's been speaking the loudest the entire time. There's a structure in the Hermetic tradition that named this dynamic with more precision than most people give it credit for. In Kabbalistic structure, the Sephirot of Yesod, the ninth sphere on the Tree of Life, associated with the foundation of manifested form, is described as the direct interface between the inner world and outer expression, the gathering point through which all the higher, more abstract aspects of consciousness must pass before they become circumstance. What modern manifestation teaching loosely calls the subconscious maps, with striking structural precision onto Yesod's function. It's the foundation through which assumption is filtered before it becomes form, and in the Kabbalistic model, Yesod is explicitly described as accumulating and storing impressions over time, not resetting with each new conscious intention, but carrying forward whatever has been deposited into it, charged or not, examined or not. The tradition is describing the same priority mechanism in symbolic architecture that Wegener found in a laboratory and Jung found in clinical practice. The foundation doesn't forget. It accumulates, and whatever it has accumulated the most of, charge-wise, determines the shape of what passes through into form. Now, pull the convergence together, because this is where the full picture comes into view. Goddard says, you become what you assume, and assumption is causal. Jung says what you refuse to look at doesn't disappear. It organizes you from underground with a force proportional to how thoroughly you've refused it, and it does so partly by relocating itself onto the people around you, who then appear to be confirming it independently. Wegener says the act of refusing it is precisely what keeps its charge elevated, because suppression requires monitoring, and monitoring keeps the signal active. The Kabbalistic structure of Yesod says the foundation accumulates every impression, examined or not, and doesn't discharge automatically. It carries forward until something deliberately enters it and revises what's stored. 4 traditions, centuries apart in some cases, none built with reference to the others, all converging on a single operational claim. You aren't manifesting from your conscious intention. You're manifesting from whichever assumption carries the most unresolved charge. And in almost every practitioner who's done the surface work diligently and still gets the old result, that high charge assumption is the shadow material they've spent the most energy not looking at, which, not coincidentally, is the material that's had the most time, completely undisturbed, to accumulate force. There's a second function of the shadow that most discussions skip entirely, and it matters here because it explains why the shadow doesn't just sit inert until you decide to examine it. It actively organizes your perception of other people in the meantime, which means it's shaping your environment in real time, not just waiting to be addressed. Jung called this projection, and he was specific that it isn't optional. The material the conscious ego refuses to own doesn't vanish into storage. It gets relocated unconsciously onto people in the environment who carry even a trace of the disowned quality, and the ego then experiences that quality as belonging entirely to the other person, as something out there, something done to them, rather than something running from within. This is why the man who's never examined his own unworthiness so often finds himself, with uncanny consistency, surrounded by people who seem to confirm it. A partner who withholds, an employer who undervalues him, a friend who's subtly dismissive. He experiences this as evidence about the world. It's more precisely evidence about where his own refused material has been relocated. The mirror isn't metaphorical here, it's operational. The world reflects the shadow because the shadow has nowhere else to go, and projection is the specific mechanism by which an internal, refused assumption becomes an external, apparently independent circumstance. That's the mirror principle and the priority signal converging into a single operation. You aren't just manifesting from the shadow. You're populating your circumstances with people whose role, psychologically, is to carry the part of you that you wouldn't carry yourself. This also explains a pattern that confuses almost every serious manifestation practitioner at some point. Doing real, deliberate work on a specific assumption, watching it seem to improve internally, and then finding the external circumstance briefly intensify before it changes. Jung's framework and the clinical literature built on it since describes this as a near-universal feature of working directly with shadow material. When a projection is in the process of being withdrawn, the relationship or situation carrying it frequently produces a final, sharper confirmation of the old pattern before it resolves, because the system is discharging the last of the accumulated charge rather than adding new charge. Practitioners who don't understand this mechanism frequently interpret the intensification as proof the work isn't working and abandon it at the exact point it was closest to completing. Understanding the mechanism changes what that moment means. It isn't the signal getting stronger, it's the signal emptying out. This reframes what shadow work actually is, mechanistically rather than therapeutically. Shadow work, in this model, isn't self-improvement. It isn't healing in the soft, vague sense the word has been flattened into. It's signal recovery. It's the deliberate, specific act of locating the highest charge unrevised material in the system and entering it directly, not affirming over it, not distracting from it, not transcending it through enough positive repetition, but going into the actual scene, the actual self-concept, the actual refused identity, and revising it at the level of felt experience. The way Goddard's revision technique and modern reconsolidation research both describe. Once that charge is addressed, it stops out-competing the conscious assumption, not because the conscious assumption got louder, but because the only thing that was ever beating it has been resolved. This is why people who do real shadow work, not the surface version, but the actual confrontation with refused material, frequently report that their manifestation practice, the same techniques they'd been using for years without result, suddenly starts working. The technique didn't change, the competition did. Go back to the man in the opening. He wasn't failing at manifestation. He was succeeding at it completely, with total mechanical fidelity. He was simply manifesting from the assumption with the most charge, which wasn't the one he was consciously practicing. His unworthiness, unexamined, decades old, monitored and therefore kept active by his own avoidance of it, was the dominant signal the entire time. And the relationship, the income, the recognition organized themselves around it with the same precision the technique promises, just pointed at a different target than the one he thought he was aiming at. He wasn't unlucky. He wasn't doing the technique wrong. He had two assumptions running, and the older one had more charge because nobody had ever gone in and revised it. The reticular activating system wasn't failing him. It was working exactly as designed, filtering the world according to whichever identity held the most unresolved force, and presenting him with a world that confirmed it, night after night. With the same mechanical reliability a thermostat uses to hold a room at a set temperature. Go back to the woman who keeps finding the same dynamic in different bodies. She wasn't choosing badly. Her shadow had a specific identical assumption about her own worth and intimacy, installed early, refused consistently, and therefore monitored and therefore charged every single time a new relationship began. The new partner wasn't the variable. The new city wasn't the variable. The unrevised assumption about herself, sitting underneath every conscious hope she brought into the relationship, was the only variable that mattered, and it had never once been asked to change, because she'd never once gone in and looked at it directly. It had been running on default the entire time, gathering force from every year she didn't examine it, exactly the way Yesod is described as gathering force from every impression it's never asked to release. This is the operational truth underneath the whole mechanism, and it's the reason this video is called what it's called. Your shadow is manifesting before you are. It's been running the priority signal since before your conscious mind learned the vocabulary to even describe what assumption is. Every visualization, every affirmation, every deliberate feeling of the wish fulfilled has been competing not against a neutral background, but against a fully charged, decades-deep, continuously monitored assumption that was never invited to the table because you've spent your life making sure it never had to be looked at. The conscious wish isn't weak. It's simply never had the floor. It's been speaking into a room where something else has been talking, uninterrupted, the entire time. This isn't a reason for despair, and despite how it may sound, it isn't a reason to fear what you might find if you finally look. It's the opposite. It means the mechanism was never broken. It means the law was always operating exactly as Goddard described. Assumption is causal, without exception. And the only missing variable was which assumption had actually been given the most charge. That variable isn't fixed. Wegener's research shows the charge is a function of monitoring, not of the material's inherent power, which means the moment monitoring stops, because the material has finally been looked at directly instead of continuously avoided, the charge begins to discharge. Reconsolidation research shows that a charged memory, accessed and given new emotional content while it's in its plastic window, restructures at the level of the synapse, not merely the level of belief. The shadow isn't an enemy that has to be defeated. It's a signal that's never been received. The moment it's received, not suppressed, not affirmed over, but actually entered and revised, it stops outcompeting the wish, because the only thing that was ever beating the wish was the energy spent refusing to look at it. Neville said it in 1948, in a lecture he gave with no idea that a Harvard psychologist would spend a career proving the mechanics of suppression decades later, and he'll still be right in 100 years. You don't get what you want. You get what you are. Almost everyone who hears that sentence applies it to the self they're willing to look at. The mechanism has never once cared which self that is. It only cares which one has the charge. The distance between those two statements, the self you present and the self that's actually been running the signal, is the entire mechanism. And it's been waiting this whole time for you to go in and look.